And the camera is okay. I'm sitting here now.
Yeah. Hello. Καλησπέρα, χρόνια πολλά, καλή χρονιά. Ευχαριστούμε θερμά για την παρουσία όλων. Χαιρόμαστε που ξεκινάμε αμέσως την πρώτη εβδομάδα μετά τις διακοπές. Η συγκυρία, sorry Άμι, I mean just to say Happy New Year. We are glad that it's a good coincidence hosting Amy hosting Holmes for our first meeting of the year because she's a very, very well-known specialist of the region. She comes directly from Syria. She was in Syria the previous week. Okay, previous days. So it's very interesting to listen from her impressions, what's going on, to the extent possible, of course, to say what is going on, because it's not that obvious what is going on, which forces are intervening, what are the players in situ, and so on. Most welcome, Ami, to be with us today and with our good friends in the room. And we look forward to your presentation and the discussion that will follow. I have to be grateful to Thanasis Platias, our colleague and good friend, for the initiative to bring Ami here at this. This is one more excellent sign of cooperation between the Institute and the Council that we are looking forward to pursue even more intensively in 2025. Thank you very much, Thanasis.
Καλημέρα και από μένα, χρόνια πολλά. It's really a great pleasure to introduce Professor Holmes, that is a top expert on the region in the Middle East, but in particular Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. She's a research professor at the George Washington University, and she's also teaching at the Bush School of Government. So she's doing both research and teaching in Washington, D.C. She used to be a tenured professor at the American University in Cairo, and also a research fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. I used to be there 45 years ago, actually, so we are alumni of this. She has written extensively in the area, and her latest book came something like 3-4 months ago by Oxford University Press. The title is Statelet for Survivors, the Making of the Semi-Autonomous Region in the Northeastern Syria. She spent 7 years around this area doing field research, so it's really a top expert. Nobody expected the fall of the Assad regime. Now, in retrospect, it's very easy to explain. I mean, the basic sources of support, there were Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. And all these three players have weakened. So in retrospect, when this thing happened, we say, oh, yes, it's natural, but nobody really expected it. And the change of the regime has huge geopolitical implications, and some of these implications will be discussed today. The title of Professor Holmes' presentation would be the geopolitical implication of the fall of the Assad regime, Syria, Turkey, and the United States, and hopefully you will put Israel into the picture because it's also another important player in Syria. So clearly, the fall of the regime has produced losers, which is Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. But it's not clear yet who is the winner. The conventional wisdom is that Turkey is the winner, but let's see how all this thing is played out. So, Professor Holmes, we will be delighted to hear your perspective. The first part of the talk will be recorded and will be uploaded in the internet, but the second part of the talk, we will stop the recording and we will have a more open discussion under Chatham House rules. I remind you that under Chatham House rule, you can talk about the ideas discussed, but you will not attribute it either to Professor Holmes or to any participant that they ask questions. So, Professor Holmes, the floor is yours.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much to the Council for International Relations and the Institute for International Relations, and to Athanasios especially for inviting me and for organizing this event. I'm very happy to see all of you here, and I look forward to having a fruitful conversation. Thank you. So, as was just mentioned, I've traveled to Syria and done research there since 2015, so for the past 10 years now. My book was published recently on the Northeast, and I recently, actually 3 days ago, returned from a visit to Syria where I was able to visit Damascus, Homs, Daraa, Ma'loula, as well as the Northeast again. And so I have some, fresh observations from that trip, which I'd be happy to share. But just very briefly, this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to just, show on the map. It maybe is clear to everyone, but in case not, I have a map to sort of map out the 4 different zones of control, the fragmentation since 2011, why the fall of the Assad regime happened now. Athanasios has already alluded to that. The role of external actors, the role of internal actors. I'll briefly compare local governance structures inside Syria, because I think that might tell us something about what the future government in Syria might look like. And then I'll discuss Turkish-Kurdish dynamics and how the Turkey-PKK conflict has actually transformed because of the Syrian conflict. And then I'll end by just briefly referring to the US-French role that may, the role that the United States may play with the incoming Trump administration, based on comments between the French and American foreign ministers 2 days ago. So, as a result of the conflict in Syria, which began in 2011, Syria has been effectively divided into 4 different regions of control until the fall of the Assad regime. And these are the area in sort of pink, that was the area controlled by the former Assad regime. The area in yellow in the northeast, that's the area controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or from now on, I may just refer to them as SDF, but that's the Syrian Democratic Forces led by Kurds, but it's now become a multi-ethnic force. So I don't refer to them as Kurdish forces because that's actually inaccurate. And I think that also is problematic because it plays into misperceptions about the region. And one of the things I'd like to do with my research is clarify those misperceptions. So the Northeast is under SDF control and is, until now, that's the area where the United States also has a presence on the ground. The SDF are the key partners in the US-led global coalition to defeat ISIS, which includes now 87 different countries and partners around the world. So about 1/3 of all the countries in the world are partners with the SDF. The area in light green at the top is the area that's occupied by Turkey and Turkish proxies. The Turkish proxy force, I'll go over that in a minute, but they're now referred to as the Syrian National Army, or SNA. And then the area in white is Idlib. So that's where HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was based until they started the offensive that led to the fall of the Assad regime. So these are the 4 different regions of Syria. And, my trip to Damascus and southern Syria just over the past couple of weeks really also made clear to me that Syrians have really been living in 4 different realities over the past 13, 14 years because they have not been able to easily travel between these different areas. It's difficult even to communicate in some cases. And there's also, Syria is a country where the problem of disinformation or misinformation is extremely worrying. So there's a lot of misperceptions also within Syria about these different parts of the country. Am I speaking too quickly, or it's okay? Okay, great. Okay, are there any questions about this until now? Okay. So why did this happen now? So I'm not going to claim to have predicted this. However, in an interview on October 4th, so about 6 weeks, almost 2 months before the offensive began that led to the toppling of the Assad regime, in an interview about my book with the Weatherhead Center at Harvard, a Q&A about my research and book, I made the point that the fact that Russia and Iran are distracted from Syria is actually an opportunity for the United States and 85, 87 members of the global coalition to reprioritize our efforts to find a solution to the Syrian conflict. Russia obviously was distracted because of Ukraine, and Iran because of since October 7, the conflict between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah. So I was trying to make the point already back in October that this would actually be an opportunity for the international community to find a resolution to the Syrian conflict, because the key backers of the Assad regime, Russia and Iran, they themselves had deprioritized their support to Assad, and that we could therefore, if we would have the wherewithal to reprioritize our efforts, we could perhaps resolve this conflict. So instead of, however, a real initiative, I think, coming from the United States or the United Nations, which has been mediating the talks in Geneva, it was non-state actors that really took the initiative and led to the toppling of the Assad regime. So Athanasios mentioned that the conventional wisdom perhaps is that Turkey is the winner now that Assad is gone. I am not convinced of that, actually. I believe that, and it's important to remember, actually, that Erdogan was still trying to normalize with the Assad regime. This is from just a press clip from the Associated Press from August of last year, where Turkey and Russia resumed joint patrols in northern Syria as Ankara was seeking to mend ties with Assad. So Erdogan had tried to normalize with the Assad regime, similar to how some other countries in the Gulf had normalized with the Assad regime. And Italy actually had sent its special envoy back to Damascus in late November, so also about a week or so before this offensive was launched that led to the toppling of the Assad regime. So there were a number of, so to sort of claim that Turkey was somehow the mastermind of this, I think is not accurate. And I think that now they are trying to reap the benefits of this, but that the toppling of the Assad regime was actually much more complex, and that really the United States, as maybe some of you saw the press conference that President Biden gave one day after Assad fell, in which he said, the U.S. support to Ukraine after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine led to the weakening of Russia, and the U.S. support to Israel after October 7 contributed to indirectly the weakening of both Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. That this also played a role in the fall of the Assad regime, along with the other international, efforts by other international actors, including Israeli strikes against Hezbollah in Syria. So the Turkish policy towards Syria, which I'm going to focus on here because that's where I think the big question is about the future also, and where I think there's still some, the Turkish role in Syria is quite complex. This is a report from June of last year by Syrians for Truth and Justice on the Turkish airstrikes that have targeted the civilian infrastructure in northeast Syria, where they've targeted, this is an oil facility in the northeast, but they've also targeted other civilian infrastructure, including medical clinics that are funded by USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, as well as other civilian infrastructure. So the larger question of Turkey's behavior in Syria is related to, of course, changes in Turkish foreign policy, and what appears to be perhaps a, realignment or drifting away from some of the, core principles that have guided Turkish foreign policy for decades as a NATO ally, including the purchase of S-400s from Russia, delaying the NATO accession of Finland and Sweden, the Astana process with Russia and Iran, the drone campaign that I just referred to, which has killed SDF leaders who defeated ISIS, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the creation of proxy forces, the Syrian National Army, or SNA, which used to be the Free Syrian Army, Jaish al-Hor, that fought against Assad. And under Turkish patronage since 2019, that Syrian National Army has actually shifted away from clashes with the Assad regime to instead prioritizing clashes with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. So Turkish patronage kind of transformed the SNA away from anti-Assad operations to anti-Kurdish or anti-SDF operations. And Turkey's launched 3 ground operations in Syria. The Turkish-held parts of Syria are about the size of Lebanon. And this is a photo of Erdogan's meeting with Khaled Meshal. So, this would be a much larger discussion, and we could have a, long debate just about this issue. But to sum up, I think a lot of these changes in Turkish foreign policy are actually related to their domestic policies, including, in particular, the Kurdish issue. And so Turkish policy towards Syria is really driven by its internal domestic politics vis-a-vis the Kurds. And the collapse of the peace process in Turkey in 2015 is really what inaugurated then this more aggressive approach to Syria beginning in 2016. So the first Turkish ground operation in Syria was 2016, very soon after the peace process, with the PKK collapsed in 2015. So this transformation of the Free Syrian Army into the SNA that I just briefly alluded to is something that, it's the Syrian National Army is let's call it an umbrella organization, for lack of a better word, that includes hundreds, previously hundreds of separate, militias or units were rebranded and brought under this umbrella of the SNA, which includes somewhere around 40, 42, 45 units. Some of the most well-known are Faylaq al-Sham, the Sultan Suleiman Shah Brigade, Ahrar al-Shakia, Sultan Murad, etc. Some of them have been sanctioned by the United States for serious human rights abuses. But these are essentially the forces that Turkey has been using since for the past several years, and that were rebranded in 2019. And so Turkish efforts to control Syria are not, that's a matter of public record, right? This is one of their documents from their put out by the Turkish ministry about their intention to control that entire northern strip of Syria. So you may have noticed that in that the diagram that included the different SNA factions, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, was not one of them. So HTS, who led the offensive against Damascus, was not part of the SNA, is not part of the SNA. And so they're actually more independent of Turkey. The leader of HTS, as I'm sure all of you know, he's been in the media quite a bit now, is Ahmed el-Shara, but he's known as by his nom de guerre, Jolani. And so I'll refer to him as Jolani from now on. So HTS is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, and it's designated as a terrorist organization by the United Nations, the United States, and other countries. In 2016, Jolani split from Al-Qaeda, and since then he's sort of gone on a charm offensive trying to convince the West that he's now a moderate rebel and that he's renounced his previous extremist beliefs. And he's, whether he's actually done that is a big question, and I think the debate is still ongoing about that. But I want to just emphasize that although a lot of media attention has been on HTS since the fall of Assad as sort of, and they've been sort of given credit for the fall of the Assad regime, in my view, that's also inaccurate, because the HTS was just one of 4 Syrian rebel coalitions that actually led to the fall of the Assad regime. The others are the Kurdish-led SDF, which evicted the Syrian regime from Qamishli and Hasaka. They had some small areas that they controlled in Qamishli and Hasaka. The Southern Front, which is also sometimes called Southern Operations Room or Amaliyat Junub Suri in Arabic, they're in Daraa and Suwaida, where the Druze minority live. And it was actually the Southern Operations Room that got to Damascus first, before HTS. So they were actually there first, the Southern Operations Room, people from Daraa and Suwaida, under the leadership of Ahmed al-Auda and a Colonel Monter al-Dohri, who I was able to interview during my visit to Syria. And then finally, the SNA, these sort of Turkish proxy forces, they also initially, when HTS went on the offensive in Aleppo, the SNA were involved very briefly at the beginning, but then very quickly the SNA diverted. And again, instead of trying to evict the Syrian regime from Aleppo, they really were fighting the SDF. And so, but these, in any case, these four rebel groups were all part of this offensive that eventually led to the collapse of the Assad regime. Also, I think it's important to emphasize that for the most part, the Assad regime, the soldiers in the Syrian Arab Army, which is officially how it's called, didn't really fight back. I mean, for the most part, many of them just dropped their weapons, took off their uniforms, put on civilian clothes and left and ran away. So it's not as if there was a big, this was a military offensive that involved a lot of casualties. They were, for the most part, walking into Hama and Holmes and taking the cities without much, without much violence from the Syrian regime army. So, is HTS, have they really reformed? Are they really going to become moderate and inclusive? That's, again, a big question. On January 1st, the HTS Minister of Education, and I want to also emphasize that until now, the caretaker government that has been appointed, which is supposed to be in charge until March, and then in March, the sort of transition phase is going to begin. But this caretaker government, to my knowledge, unless there's been some change in the last day or so, they're all from Idlib. So they're not, the caretaker government is not representative of Syria. And that's one of the major concerns. And this HTS Minister of Education, Nazir Mohammed al-Qadri, made a decision on January 1st to change the school curriculum. And of course, the Syrian school curriculum had taught sort of Ba'athist ideology and, to praise the role of Bashar al-Assad and Hafez al-Assad, etc. But so people had sort of expected they might just drop those references, the sort of Ba'athist ideology from the curriculum, but they went farther than that. And they've also removed references to the injustices of the Ottomans. And they've also included references to Jews and Christians as those who have gone astray from the true path. And so this has, understandably worried a number of people, and it caused a bit of an uproar within Syria. Because one day before that, Jolani had actually a meeting with a number of the Christian leaders of the Christian churches in Syria. And the Christian minority in Syria is quite diverse. There are Greek Orthodox, there are Armenians, there are Syriac Christians, Assyrians, etc. But he had a meeting with different leaders of the churches. And so it looked as if this was going to be a sign of him reaching out to the Christian minority. But then one day later, this announcement was made that the school curriculum will now refer to Jews and Christians as people who've gone astray. So it's a bit of a contradictory, how should I say, policy. But this is just one example of how people are concerned about what the caretaker government is doing already. So I'll talk now a little bit about the SDF, because that's, again, a key player in all of this, and that's where I've done my research over a number of years. The survey that I started of the SDF was in 2015 in Kobani. That's where the photo was taken. Kobani, as I'm sure many of you know, was that's the city where the US partnership with the SDF began. At the time, it was still the YPG-YPJ, the Kurdish militia or armed group. And then in September of 2015, the YPG-YPJ was transformed into the SDF. And the SDF then evolved over time into, instead of just a Kurdish armed group, a multi-ethnic group, where actually now the majority of rank and file members in the SDF are Arabs, as well as the Christian minority being represented, and some Yazidis and Syrian Turkmen as well. So I did the survey in Arabic, Kurmanji, and Turkish. It included basic information about their ethnicity, whether their gender, their age, tribal affiliation, why they joined the SDF, what their views were about gender equality, because the SDF claims to be, promoting, they famously have included women into positions of authority in the SDF and to be promoting gender equality. So I wanted to know, do those ideas that they claim to espouse, are those just ideas that the leaders are themselves advocating for, or do the rank and file actually also believe that? I mean, that was one of the questions that I wanted to understand, and also their plans for the future. So I won't, go into that, but the book that I published on this is called Stateless Survivors: The Making of a Semi-Autonomous Region in Northeast Syria. One chapter of the book is about the SDF, but I have another chapter about ISIS and the policies of Daesh, or the Islamic State, towards women in particular, and then the policies by the autonomous administration to promote women into this new autonomous administration that they've created. I have a chapter on the economic underpinnings, so the economic underpinnings of this semi-autonomous region, including their control of oil, gas, and agricultural resources. The school the new school system that they've developed. So they continue, of course, to teach Arabic, but they've also introduced Kurdish and Aramaic, the Aramaic language spoken by the Syriac and Syrian minority, into their curriculum as well. And then I have a chapter on the Yazidi minority. In government-controlled parts of Syria, Yazidis were not recognized as a minority. The autonomous administration, for the first time, recognized them as a distinct minority, and so they've also not only recognized them but also included them in the structures of the autonomous administration. So this is some photos of the SDF members taking my survey. The photo of the women. Those are women in the Manbij Military Council. So Manbij is one of the major cities west of the Euphrates River that is also part of the SDF. And that's where now, so those women had lived under ISIS for over 3 years when ISIS controlled the area. But now that after it was liberated from ISIS, the SDF assumed control of the region, and those Arab women joined the Manbij Military Council, or the SDF. And that is where now a lot of fighting is happening between Turkish-backed forces and the SDF over Manbij specifically. So I said earlier that, this is an Arab majority force. These are the Arab tribal affiliations of the SDF members. I found to my surprise that Arabs from virtually all of the tribes in the region are represented in the SDF. So it's not that they just worked with certain tribes and excluded others, but they truly seem to have been open to all of the Arab tribes in the region to join the SDF, including some Arab tribes who in the past had been used by the Syrian regime of Assad to suppress the Kurdish minority. So I saw this as an indication that the SDF has made some efforts to, because of its inclusive nature, that they've actually made some steps to overcoming the sectarianism that has plagued the Syrian conflict since the beginning. And I was also surprised to find that there are some Arabs who joined the SDF who lived in parts of Syria that were not under SDF control. For example, Aleppo. So these are some Arabs who lived in Aleppo and voluntarily left Aleppo to go to the northeast to join the SDF. And this is one Arab man from Aleppo, from a middle-class family. His father was a businessman, his mother was a nurse, who said that the SDF should manage, quote, Syria in the next stage. So again, this is an indication that this is a project that has support not just among Kurds, but also among Arabs, as well as the smaller minorities of Christians, Yazidis, etc. And a final finding from my research that I point out in the book is that the SDF are not separatists. And this is what, I've been, repeating this for many years, and I have to, keep repeating it because they're being accused of this again now. But they have always said they want to remain part of Syria. They've always said that. And this was also what I found in my survey, that the rank and file members of the SDF are also saying this. It's not just what the leadership says. And this is one of one of the signs from the autonomous administration in 4 languages: Arabic, Kurdish, Turkish, and Aramaic. So just very briefly about how this Turkish-Kurdish conflict has been transformed because of the Syrian conflict. Although the SDF is Arab majority, it's not just a Kurdish force, and although they are committed to staying within Syria, Turkey continues to view them as a threat, and that's how they justified launching these 3 cross-border operations. And so, in all of my field research with people in the region, I wasn't hearing about any kind of cross-border attacks from Syria into Turkey, but I thought, let's look at the ACLED data, the armed conflict location and event data, and see what that tells us about this conflict, because maybe something was happening and I wasn't aware of it, or they weren't telling me. And lo and behold, the ACLED data also confirmed that the number of cross-border incidents from Syria into Turkey are the orange. They're barely visible because they're very small. So from January of 2017 until August of 2020, there were something like 22 reported incidents of cross-border attacks, whereas there were more than 3,000 attacks from Turkey and Turkish-backed forces against the SDF. So, very briefly, these Turkish interventions in Syria are largely based on disinformation, so that they're trying to justify this based on a non-existent threat. And the US and the senior American diplomat who was on the ground in 2019 during the last major Turkish cross-border operation called Peace Spring, his name is Ambassador William Roebuck. He was the deputy special envoy to the Defeat ISIS coalition. He was on the ground because the State Department also has a few people on the ground in addition to the military personnel. So this happened after a phone call between Trump and Erdogan, where Erdogan just convinced Trump to withdraw from Syria, and then Trump tweeted about it, and a withdrawal was initiated, but then that American withdrawal was later halted because of an outcrying from members of Congress, and Trump hadn't consulted anyone about it, including his national security advisor or the Pentagon or anyone. And so this Turkish cross-border operation not just displaced civilians and put, obviously, the civilians in harm's way, but also American personnel. And Ambassador Roebuck, who was on the ground again when this happened, and he'd been there for the previous 1.5 or 2 years leading up to the intervention, he described this cross-border operation as a, quote, catastrophe, and also said that the Syrian side of the border had been quiet until Turkey violated it with that cross-border operation. So that was in an internal memo that was leaked to the press. You can read it in the New York Times, I believe. So this ACLED data is also confirmed by an internal memo by Ambassador Roebuck that was leaked to the press. So the SDF has been, our partner in defeating the Islamic State, and actually protected Turkey by defeating the Islamic State, and are not engaging in cross-border attacks until now, and they want to remain part of Syria. So I just, for the record, that's what the data on the SDF says. Now the situation, it's not clear if it may change. I mean, these clashes that are happening in Manbij are quite fierce, but again, this is within Syria. This is not like something that's happening inside Turkey or a threat to Turkey. It's happening within Syria because the Turkish proxies are attacking the SDF, and the SDF is trying to reclaim Manbij. Okay, so I want to just very briefly highlight some of the differences about the civilian governance structures now. Which I wrote about in my book, and focusing specifically on women's rights and the rights of minorities. Because I think this will highlight how different these different regions of Syria are and how they've really been living in different realities, right, over the past 13 years. So under the Assad regime, polygamy and child marriage was allowed or was not punished. There were mitigating excuses for honor killings. A man could prevent his wife from working outside the home. In the autonomous administration, there's a quota for women in all governing bodies, from local councils up to the SDC, the Syrian Democratic Council, a co-chair system for leadership. Child marriage is prohibited, polygamy is prohibited, but it's not yet uniformly implemented. Honor killings are considered to be murder. And there's an attempt to include women in the economy through various cooperatives that they've established. In the Turkish occupied areas, the UN Committee of Inquiry on Syria, Amnesty International, and many other human rights organizations have documented extensive abuses, that women are subjected to a, quote, pervasive climate of fear, et cetera. So these are quite disparate in terms of their approaches to women in these three different regions of Syria. Regarding Yazidis, I mentioned before that Yazidis are recognized in the autonomous administration, where that was not the case under the Assad regime. And in the Turkish occupied parts, Afrin in the northwest was actually where you had the largest Yazidi minority. And the Yazidi shrines, religious shrines in those areas have been all either destroyed or desecrated since it was occupied by Turkey and the Turkish-backed proxies. So it seems to be that there's also a lot of, that there's also clear differences in terms of the treatment of minorities in these different regions. Last summer, the autonomous administration announced that they wanted to hold elections for mayors. They have a co-mayor system where men and women co-govern cities, and they had announced they wanted to hold elections. Turkey announced that they would, conduct another round of airstrikes against the region, and then the United States State Department spokesperson put out a statement saying the time wasn't right for elections to take place. Those would have been the largest elections outside regime control since the start of the conflict if they had gone forward. But after the US, basically said this is not the right time to do that, they did not hold those elections. Now Jolani has announced that elections will take place maybe in 4 years. So this, and when I've spoken during my visit to Syria most recently, some people thought that was like way too long, that they should have elections within 1 year or 2 years. Other people felt that it would take time for Syrians to begin to create new political parties and establish, a system of having elections that would be free and fair and transparent, et cetera. So, and then finally, at the joint press conference on January 8 between Anthony Blinken and the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, that he said that this was a statement from the French Foreign Minister that, saying that the Kurds in Syria for both the United States and France have been some reliable and resolute allies in the fight against Islamic terrorism. There's now hope that Syria will recover from this, and that the Kurds in Syria have to play their role. We owe it to them. They've been our companions. They've been fighting together with us against Daesh. And it is a matter for the future of Syria. It is extremely important that the Kurds can fully contribute to the future of their country. So there's a possibility that the US and French will, that they appear to be trying to mediate this conflict as well. So not just the United States, but potentially also France could play a role in this. But that's the current situation regarding the situation in Northeast Syria. So I hope that this is helpful, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Super, this was fascinating. I mean, one of the concepts in geopolitics is the concept of Sutter Belt. In Sutter Belt, you have a situation that in a state, you have competition of great powers. Clearly here, we have competition between Russia and the United States. You had local powers like Israel, Turkey, Iran. And then what Amy presented is a Sutter belt in steroids, because you had a lot of competition in